How much mana does it cost to draw 2 cards in Magic the Gathering, or in your TCG of choice? What are you able to destroy with 1 cost removal? And what power level is average at each cost up the mana curve in that game? In all games, these are abstract questions that can change a lot as certain aspects are power crept and certain aspects are dialed down. Sometimes you can get 2 cards for 2 mana, and sometimes you're perfectly fine paying 4. However, as soon as I said draw 2 cards, a lot of Magic players probably thought about 1 card and 1 cost specifically. Divination is a 3-cost sorcery with the simple effect of draw 2 cards, and it's been reprinted many times. Shock provides a solid baseline for what you can expect from 1 mana red removal, so much so that a 1 mana spell that deals 2 damage is often simply shorthand called a shock. Likewise, a 2 mana 2/2 is often called a bear, named after the card Grizzly Bears. Grizzly Bears has no abilities, but it gives you a solid baseline for what stats to expect for its mana cost. If you want to know what power you can expect at each cost or level, generally most games will have a few different basic creatures with very few or no abilities at all show up in each set. So even if cards with more powerful abilities are available, you at least have a baseline to compare those cards against. There's plenty of these baseline cards out there, and they fulfill a few different, important roles within a card game. At their most basic level, these are simple, straightforward effects that are useful for new players that are still learning the game. TCGs have detailed, complicated rules that can take a while to get comfortable with, and having each card read like a textbook makes the learning curve substantially more difficult. Plenty of games don't play all that well if you simplify the cards too much. But having even a portion of the deck be simple, straightforward cards can make a game much less intimidating to learn. On a slightly deeper level, these cards can also help shape player expectations on what a card or effect should cost. Drawing 2 cards for 4 mana isn't particularly exciting unless there's some bonus upside, but drawing 2 cards for 2 mana, even if you have to jump through some hoops, feels like you're cheating the system a little bit. Likewise, in One Piece, you start seeing characters at 5,000 power that can deal damage unassisted at cost 3, which is able to attack by your 3rd turn. So if you're attacking for damage on turn 2, that's always going to feel a little bit exciting. But by turn 4 or 5, if you're still only deploying 5k power characters, it can kind of feel like you're starting to fall behind a little bit. While these baseline cards will often show up in sets to fill out the common lineup, even if they're not in a set, these cost rates are still going to exist as unspoken rules in the design of the game. So while players are usually not going to be all that excited to see these cards show up in booster packs, having these baselines printed on actual physical cards can still help players to judge power level, especially if it's been shifted from set to set. It's always worth remembering that these cards are never gospel. They will change over time as power level shifts. Magic printing instant speed divination is a clear signal that power level is being ramped up, while seeing Doomblade be replaced by Murder or Lightning Bolt being replaced by Shock shows that we should expect a little less efficiency from removal effects going forward. So, when you're designing your own game, these are the cards that you should be thinking about including in the very first batch of cards you design. For players that are new to your game, they're not only going to be a bunch of very basic effects that'll make it easier to learn to play, but they'll provide a straightforward cost expectation for various effects. For designers, these are also very helpful. First up, it lets you set the cost for basic abilities in early playtests. Cards need to be balanced against each other. So if drawing 2 cards costs 4, but powerful aggressive creatures cost only 1 or 2, players are going to be overrun pretty quickly before they're able to start using any of these card draw effects. So they simply won't add them to their decks, and if you are hoping to have a card draw focused control strategy in the game, it's simply not going to happen and the game is going to shift to a more aggro based format. This can also drastically change the shape of your game. A game that lets you draw 2 cards for 1 mana is going to play very differently from a game that requires you to spend 3 mana for the same effect. And rules that may work in a 3 mana game may be too clunky for a 1 mana game. Then, once you know what cost each effect should be, so it balances with the rest of your game, it's going to make it much easier for future card designs. If you know that drawing 2 cards should cost 3, and that dealing 2 damage should cost 1, then a card that does both should cost between 4 and 5 mana, depending on how useful it is having the two effects appear on one card. Having this effect cost 3 is likely going to be overpowered, and it's pretty easy to see that having it cost 6 is going to be significantly overcosted. None of this is going to remove the need for playtesting, but it can help smooth out the process a bit. Overall, both players and designers should have a good idea of what the baseline costs are for various game effects, and while you can get away without including such simple cards in the game, having them is ultimately going to be more helpful than you may appreciate when you open that 20th copy of Divination.